Hello, listeners. If you've enjoyed these narrations, please click on that like and subscribe button. This all began as a project for my school. I was going to show the history of my town by recording interviews with old residents. I did a couple of those to start off with, speaking to a former teacher at my school and a retired hotel doorman. The teacher was Miss Turner, a widow for a decade, and in her 75th year, she spoke a lot about the way education systems were a lot better in her time, and that some of her pupils who had gone on to do great things. The doorman's name was Mr. Watkins, and he was an 89-year-old man. He made the hotel sound like a glamorous place, and he told me some really interesting stories about the people who used to stay there. He also said how he was sad when he had to retire because of his age, and even sadder that the hotel finally closed its doors for the last time 20 years ago. The interviews were great, but I decided they needed some extra to make them just a bit more attention-grabbing. So, I found music from way back that was copyright-free and was going to add recordings of ambient sounds from the streets and the buildings that interviews were talking about. I'd mix it all up together into a package, and it was going to be awesome. That's when something happened which threw everything off tracks, and I ended up submitting a completely different project. You see, I heard strange sounds in the background of one of the ambient recordings, sounds which eventually led me to some pretty dark places. That was just a few years ago. I'm a university student now, but I've kept the original file, and I've decided, after a lot of thought, to share what's on there. The sound file was recorded in the lobby of the hotel Mr. Watkins had worked in. The hotel was derelict by then, and empty apartments had some broken furniture and piles of litter and leaves that had much drifted away. I had snuck in by force in a gap in the boarded up doorway and was pretty sure I wasn't meant to be in there. I was feeling pretty nervous. That's why the first time on the recording and the sound of just my breathing, it's loud as I come close to hyperventilating, and that's when you can hear me say to myself, "Relax, dude." I take another deep breath, slow, deep. I remember thinking how this would help calm me down and how it worked. The next sound is the building creaking. It was late November and there was a storm outside. I was pretty windswept myself, and I guess the fabric of the old place was struggling in the gales. And then there was the first of the strange sounds. It's like the wind had got inside the building and was moving through the litter and the leaves. And the second strange sound is longer, and the third is drawn out even more. Both again made me think of the wind, of a relentless, eerie force. And then there's my footsteps as I leave the hotel. The recording ends here. I listened to that same recording for the first time in my bedroom back at home, and I felt a coldness pass through me. I had heard the noises when I was there, on my own, standing in the lobby, but they hadn't really stood out to me at the time. But listening to the recording, they chilled me to my bone. I was gripped. I listened to the recording repeatedly, long into the night, and about 4 a.m. is when I finally heard this. The first sound is actually the sound of a girl's voice saying, "Please." The second sound is her asking, "Please, somebody help me." The third sound is her yet again, "I just want my Millie, please." The more I listened to the recording, the more I became convinced this is what had been captured. I didn't sleep at all that night, and the next day at school I couldn't focus on any of the lessons, partly because I was exhausted, but more because all I could think about was the voice on that recording. What was it? I wondered as my mind raced. How was it even possible? I had been completely on my own in the derelict lobby. It was a mystery to me, and one I was determined to get to the bottom of. I decided the best place to start would be by going back to see the doorman, Mr. Watkins, and just asking if he knew the words on the recording meant anything. He lived in a care home for the elderly, and was looking even more frailer than when I had interviewed him last. He shook my hand in an old-fashioned way and smiled at me and invited me to take a seat. I settled into the armchair opposite of him and told him exactly what had happened, and that's when I asked him, Was there a Millie at the hotel? Perhaps she was a staff or a regular guest, maybe. And when I did this, everything changed. The smile disappeared off his face, and he could no longer look me in the eyes. Then he started shouting for one of the carers, stating that I was somehow bothering him and that I needed to leave. I was hustled out of there double quick. I don't mind telling you that I was pretty upset by this whole experience, and definitely confused. I'd clearly upset him, and I'd wished I knew how or why I could make things better. The possibility of solving the mystery of the recording also felt like it was diminished. With all this playing in my mind, school days kept coming around, and the weekends that dragged, I just started to wish I'd never been to that hotel. In fact, I decided a couple weeks after seeing the doorman for the second time, I was just going to delete the file and forget about the whole lousy experience. And then the letter came. The address was handwritten, and inside there was a brief note wrapped around another piece of paper. The note said that, sadly, Mr. Watkins had passed away in his sleep, and that before he died, he had requested that the enclosed letter be passed on to me. My hands were shaking as I unfolded the letter. This is what it said. I've carried a secret around with me for a long time now. It's something I'm ashamed of, and that has made me hate myself through many long, sleepless nights. I thought this would never change, and I'd take my secret to the grave. But then you came along. I enjoyed meeting you for the first time, and I was happy to talk about the old times at the hotel. The good times. Then when you came to see me again, the things you said, it was like someone had taken a knife and cut me open to reveal the secrets I had buried inside myself. You see, the name Millie does mean something to me after all. It was the name of a doll that was owned by a young woman who I knew more than 60 years ago. She was a woman, not a girl, and many folks would have said she was way too old to still be walking around clutching a doll to her. But this young woman was troubled. She was skinny as a rake, and wore rags and lived on the streets near the hotel. One winter, back in '59, it was a particularly vicious winter. Predictions were the night ahead would be the worst, and lives would be lost. I knew this young woman's life was in danger if she was left out in the streets, so I told her she could shelter in the hotel if she wanted. I did this without telling any of the management. This was the only concern, was making money and attracting to even better class of guests. But I was brought up to believe in compassion. The only place I had for her was in the storage room, but it was little more than a cupboard, really. She seemed happy enough to curl up in there and go to sleep with her doll. I felt good for having helped protect this fragile creature. And that could have been that. The night passed and she could have left, and there could have been no trouble. Only one of the front desk staff, who had aspirations to be boss, found the girl fast asleep in the storage room and yelled for management. This was just before I started my shift, and when I turned up for work, I saw there was a commotion in the lobby of the hotel. Tears were streaming down her face, and she was shouting over and over for help. For her Millie. Somehow, she had separated from her doll, but the management did not care. They dragged her out into the street and left her sobbing, and still begging for Millie. It broke my heart, and I went searching for the doll so I could return it to her. But there was no trace of it in the storage room, and I could not ask around because the management would be enraged, and they threatened to fire whoever let the woman in the hotel. So I turned my back. And a few days later, I heard the young woman's body had been found on the side of the road. She had been struck by a vehicle and left. She was buried in the city cemetery with no headstone and no service, and I could never find where she was laid to rest. Could I have done more to help her when she was alive? Yes. Should I have done more to help her? Yes. But I did not. I was too scared of losing my job. You're only a kid, and a good kid, it strikes me from our couple conversations that we've had. So I don't want to pass my burden on to you. But I think you've got the right to know the truth as I know it. As for the voices that you claim to hear on your recording, I have no explanation that can be set out in a reasonable way. But now I have calmed down and had a chance to think. I wonder, perhaps there is a way to set things right. If you receive this letter, and you can forgive me for the way I treated you, perhaps you could come see me again and we could talk. The letter was signed, Yours in Hope, William Watkins. After I finished reading it, I put my head in my hands and I cried myself to sleep. And when I woke, I finally thought I understood what was happening. I understand a lot of people might just dismiss this as nonsense, and I worry to let anyone else listen to the recording, in case all they can hear is the wind in a derelict building. But I believed then, and I believe now, that I had recorded the voice of a ghost, the ghost of that young woman. Back then, as I sat there rubbing sleep from my eyes and wishing that Mr. Watkins had not died before I had a chance to ask him again, I also knew what I had to do next. I threw cold water onto my face, got wrapped up in the warmest coat, and went back to the hotel. I once more slipped in through the broken, boarded-up doorway, and I began my search. I did not record anything this time. I just rushed from empty room to empty room, dust from thrown up everywhere, and dozens of spiders scattering across the floor as I disturbed them. There was a small space that looked like it could have been the strange room that Mr. Watkins had told me about in his letter, but it was as bare as the rest of the place. And then, just as I was about to give up hope, I saw a stack of boxes tucked away in a corner. I opened one and found scarves and gloves and umbrellas. Another box had fancy-looking croquettes in it, and another an old glossy business and lifestyle magazine. I figured these were all the things that had been gathered up in the hotel when it was closed and meant for disposal, but no one had ever gotten around to it. I opened the last box and my heart did a little leap of joy. There was a doll in it. The paint on it was faded and cracks in places, and the dress was crumbled and dirty. I lifted it out of the box. "Hey, Millie. It's nice to meet you." That's when I tucked the doll into my coat and left the hotel. It was 2 bus rides and a very long walk to get to the city cemetery. It was a run-down place, and some of the headstones were lying on the ground, and there was weeds everywhere. It was quiet. I could only see a few people over on the other side of the cemetery, but I was still nervous that someone would see me and ask me what I was doing. I knelt down with my hands scooped out the earth from the patch of ground. I took the doll out of my coat and put it into the hole that I had made. I gently covered it up with the loose soil and just closed my eyes. I thought of the young woman and told her that Millie was here now and that they could be together forever. I got to my feet, brushing the soil off of my jeans, and walked slowly out of the cemetery. I felt sad, but I felt okay. I had done what was right, and as far as I could see, I was hoping Mr. Watkins could have felt the same way. And now there's one more thing to do. That's when I returned to the hotel lobby for my final time and made a recording. I listened to it when I got back home. All I could hear on the recording was a lobby of silence. There was no wind, no voices, no spirits hurting. There was just peace. It was finally over. The recording continued as I left the lobby, and there was a strange sound as I stepped through the doorway. I listened to it a few times before I realized what it was. It was the voice of an old man saying thank you